And the first question that I want to ask you guys, who are the experts, can you have both? Can you do a bottom up and top down go to market strategy?
I don't actually think anyone here is going to argue that one prevails over the other in the sense of you should have one versus the other. I think, well, at least I'll tell you from my perspective, I'll agree in the sense that you need both. And you need both for the mere fact that you need them to create the what I would call like healthy friction and constructive friction between your go-to-market leadership team and your CFO and your founding team, and your board and your investors. Like as some have joked earlier, you take that top down, you create a plan of where you're going, you keep it for your founding team, you keep it for your investors, you keep it for your board, the board and the birds, and then you put it aside and you build that bottoms up to actually build a map of where you're headed. The biggest challenge that you're going to find with operating off a top down only is that you're going to get yourself as an operator into a lot of emotional conversations, debating philosophical and intellectual debates around negotiating what it is that you think you're going to need to get this magical number, versus there's a very non-emotional approach from a bottoms up that becomes logical, and you get to discuss actuals, and it becomes a trade-off discussion as opposed to an emotional negotiation. I would much rather have a trade-off discussion and say, look, if we do this, then this impacts this. And if you're willing to accept that as a board and as an investor and as a founder, I'm all in. But that's a trade-off. That's not a negotiation.
I think there's a little elephant in the room that no one's saying, because I do agree that there's a both approach. And I think you need an executive vision in order to work from the bottom, because you need a roadmap and sort of a North Star of where you're going. And I find that some companies don't align from a C-suite stakeholder perspective on what that looks like. So I think that's, maybe Jake had mentioned like some friction there, like the CMO may not agree with the CRO, and then the board has a different perspective. But what I would call the elephant in the room is the relationship between VC, private equity, and the founding and C-suite is broken. And I look at the operations behind a lot of these systems, and I look at KPIs and metrics, and I'll put in these forecasting systems, but then they're going to go off and tell the board something that tweaks that narrative because they're afraid to tell them the truth, or they're afraid to stand up to the VCs because they're afraid they're going to lose their job, pull funding, seen in a negative light. And I feel like that is an issue with the industry right now. And I think that's really important to call out.
I would argue that it's perhaps one of the biggest contributors to why the average tenure of a VP of sales an early stage startup is 12 to 18 months, is operating off of a fear top-down model. And so I would caution you to carefully run that plan to make sure that, yes, you take that guidance, but at the same time, you're running off of realistic insight off of your own numbers of what you can accomplish from a capacity perspective. Because what you don't want to do, which if you haven't gotten there yet, great for you, but for many of us, we've made mistakes earlier on in our career of hiring based off a top-down plan from the VCs of going faster. We threw a lot of warm bodies at it. What happens 6 to 8 months later, we had layoffs, and that hurts.
Yeah, to your point there, you also have to train your board to understand what the hell's going on in these forecasts. So you have these great goals and all that good stuff, but earlier somebody was talking about making the number off of mid-market instead of the top 50 companies in the world. At the end of the day, maybe your product isn't really ready for the top companies on the planet. Some of the companies that I've been part of, they have this great product, but you can't sell it for what they want, or it doesn't really fit the tier one, customers. So you have to go back and say, look, for this to be a tier one product, you need to get to work and do these things. But in the interim, we can go sell over here. And then also somebody brought up about pricing. Pricing is another huge problem in go-to-market. We sit in a room and say, yep, we think this thing is worth 50K, ACV or whatever. And in the end, we find out the market is worth 18. So there's a lot of work that goes into the go-to-market that actually allows you to get that success bottom up, but you also have to redirect those top down plans. It's a very active job.
I just want to kind of share a little bit of my experience on boards. Rarely do VCs actually come with prescriptive measures. What tends to happen, and I like to call it this way, there's company building and creating a business. That's one thing. And then there's the VC game. The minute you take money from a VC, you're in that game and you need to follow the rules. What are those rules? You need to move fast. You need to hit certain ARR. And if you don't, likely you may have somebody who believes that story, but at some point story doesn't sell. You won't raise. And I think that's more where it comes, because we are always trying to see what can be done to fix something that isn't working at the pace required by the VC market. But it's not that we're trying to impose or we think we know better. We're trying to see what can we do to make sure those companies are moving at the rhythm imposed by the VC market. Just that's how I see it, versus the VCs having expectations themselves. For whatever reason, that's what the VC market wants. And that's the pressure that's putting on the business. So we, as VCs, knowing that the next VC is going to expect that, have to push the companies to move faster.
Different issue, which is that you've got a bunch of companies that may have been very well sustainable growth companies taking an exponential path, and therefore finding challenges in having taken VC money, right? But not even having a product or a business model or anything that really meets an exponential growth pattern. They probably would have been better off in a sustainable growth pattern, building what might end up being a small business, for example. So I actually think that's a lot of the challenge we see and the root of lots of failures.
I want to go back to something Tracy said there. Like, I think fundamentally, the value of this debate or discussion exists with or without, like, the presence of VCs in the business, right? And, like, whether the VCs or investors or PE are in there, you have to have this, because something Stacy or Tracy said that stood out to me is this concept of, like, why there's friction between marketing and sales, and that, like, marketing takes time for planning. I would argue that they both do. And I think what was a fundamental change in my career was the realization when I started from a bottoms up perspective. It allowed for marketing and sales and the revenue team all to come together as a go-to-market team as a whole, to put the problem out in front of us based on, like, the actual, and say, okay, how are we going to get there? Here's our bucket of funds. Where do you want to deploy? Where do I deploy? And what do the unit economics indicate to us where we should deploy it? Versus from a top down, when I sit down with marketing, I think that's what introduced a lot of the finger pointing, because we both looked at each other and go, oh shit, what are we going to do? Well, I need money to do it my way. You need money to do it your way. And now we're going to point fingers. And I don't believe in that. That's a waste of everyone's time. So it all takes time, and the planning should occur together. And from a bottoms up perspective, we can put it out in front of us and tackle it as a team.
This is all super fascinating to me, because how many Series A or B companies have you tried to work for where there is no product market fit, or it's pure chaos? There's no process, there's no structure. So you need some tops down for structure. I think what Stacy said about the board is super interesting, and Jake mentioned about the 12 to 18 month tenure. It's the same for CMOs, right? It's probably even shorter. But most of that reason is because there is a disconnect at the board level and the VC level, not because they're not smart humans. It's just that they don't know the inner workings or the nuances. They're investors in many, many hundreds of companies. And so they don't know the nuances of your job. Your job is to be the storyteller and set the path. So I think that, and there's also not very many marketing people on boards either. Gary, you talk about, experiment. You should always be experimenting, right? But I think the disconnect between sales and marketing is that marketing takes planning and it takes time. And everybody wants everything yesterday. Well, we also want, the marketing team wants product to do everything like yesterday too, but that also doesn't necessarily happen very quickly. I think all of those things sort of like all compile on top as to why you need both. but at different stages of the game. And I do think as CROs and as CMOs, your job really is to sort of dictate upward, like, hey, this is what's happening. The communication is the key to success in any business. And if you don't have that transparency with your board or with your C-suite, then you're going to fail anyways.